commercial is a paid political commercial. I won't make that anymore. Welcome to Oldham County Mission. We appreciate everybody who is able to make it with us today, everyone who's able to be here, especially the Columbus branch. You so surprised me when I turned my computer on and we were working on sound, and blip, 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 people kept coming on. So welcome to the Columbus branch. Know that you bring enthusiasm to all of us. So your being here is our blessing. Before we get started, because we use speaker view, just check your devices. Just make sure that you're muted at this point. And then I'm going to ask you later if you would be kind enough to turn those microphones back on so that you can testify to the glory of God. But for now, so that we can kind of keep it crisp and no one bleeds over and causes any kind of frustration for those of you who are online, just make sure your devices are muted, and thank you. I'm not going to share the theme just yet. I'm just going to launch into a message this morning that I hope is a blessing for you. Probably 2 or 3 weeks ago, we had a theme that was entitled, that was themed around, needs none of it, wants all of it, if you remember that. And the message was around the necessity and the lack of necessity that God has for us and for what we can bring him. He needs none of us. He wants all of us. And I say he wants all of us as a double entendre. He wants all of us by number, each of us, and then he wants all of us by giving everything you have to the Lord. So needs none of it, wants all of it. This is all based upon, the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Okay, that's what that whole message was about, the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, which was preceded by the sacrifice of the Father. The Son sacrificed, but only because the Father demanded and requested that of the Son. For God so loved the world that he gave the only begotten Son. So that I left that meeting, I hope you did too, wondering, how can I ever repay his mercy? How can I ever repay his forgiveness? How can I ever repay his love? And it leaves us understanding that there's really no value that we can offer to him. There's nothing that we can give him in terms of all that God is. If you think of God's greatness, what value could I add? Be that as it may, he wants everything. I'm going to read a verse only to tell you as a precursor to today that we're going to try to search and put some things together. The verse comes from 2 Timothy 2:15. You all know it. In fact, if I start to read it, some of you probably could repeat it in your homes. As I'm saying this, some of you could probably repeat it in your minds right here. Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not be ashamed. Here comes the key to this. Rightly dividing the word of truth. It doesn't say read the scriptures, it says study. We read about the brothers who searched the scriptures diligently. Not just read, but search and study. Why? So that you can take the entirety of all that's in front of you, divide it out, so that you can rightly interpret all of it. We're not going to pick a verse, pull it out, use that almost regardless of everything around it. That's never how we read the word. That's never how we interpret it. Rightly dividing the word of truth. There's a scripture that says this. It's Mosiah in the 4th chapter. You can go and search all of these later. You can follow me now, but please go back and search all of these later. It says this. And I don't want anyone to be discouraged by this, but encouraged. If the knowledge of the goodness of God, what this is talking about is weigh them. Weigh everything that I'm reading to you. Remember, we're rightly dividing the word of truth. Weigh everything that I'm reading to you. If the knowledge of the goodness of God at this time has awakened you to a sense of your nothingness relative to God's greatness, I don't want anyone to say, I'm nothing and leave here discouraged. I want you to understand you're comparing only to God, not to each other, only to God. awakened you to a sense of your nothingness and your worthless and fallen state. By the way, this is the indictment for all mankind. You don't have to personalize this. This is all have come short of the glory of God. All of us have sinned. So all this is saying is when you look at God and see all that he's done for you, does it bring you to a feeling of there's nothing you can offer? There's nothing you can give him in comparison to the greatness of God. Yet my message today is give him everything. So don't be twisted by that verse. If you have come to a knowledge of the goodness of God, his matchless power, his wisdom, his patience, his long suffering towards the children of men, and also the atonement which has been prepared from the foundation of the world, that thereby salvation might come to him that puts his trust in the Lord, and should be diligent, keeping his commandments, continuing in faith, even to the end of his life. By the way, this is the plan of salvation all in one verse. I mean the life of the mortal body, not the soul, is what he says here. He even clarifies, I mean the life of the mortal body. I say, this is the man who receives salvation. Right? First verse we read is in comparison to the greatness of God. And you weigh yourself, you see, I see, we all see that I'm nothing in comparison. So I come back to the same question, what value can we bring him? And when I say that, that probably should do two things for you. It should both free you and tie you, or bind you and loose you. Let's say it that way. The binding is, what good am I to God? I'm bound to him in that sense. But it should also loose you from the feeling that there's anything you can do that he needs. So be free and understanding that all that you give to God, all of it, is your way of saying, I love you, Lord. Please understand that part of this message. I love you, Lord. How else can I repay him? So here's the foolishness of a 13-year-old. Here's the foolishness of a 20-year-old. Here's the foolishness of a 40-year-old. And these are my stories, but this is certainly not about me. But I only know my stories, so I'm going to bring them, and they're foolishness, so I don't want to bring anyone else's stories of foolishness to you. When I was 13 years old, I stopped making bad decisions. Maybe 14, I should say, because I have a hard time believing I was only 13. But when I was 14 years old, I stopped making bad party decisions. I wasn't baptized. It wasn't a commitment statement to the Lord. It certainly was because of the Lord. But I stopped indulging. I don't want to go into details. I don't know who's out there. I don't know who's listening. So I don't want to go into too many details. But I stopped all my behavior. I'll just tell you that I was very experimental at that stage of my life. I stopped at that stage, thinking I had made this great sacrifice for the Lord. The foolishness of a 14-year-old. While it's a good effort, it's nothing in comparison to all that God has done and all that the Son has done. When I was 20 years old, I played, I had graduated high school, and there was, I'll say it this way, I've never really said this out loud, but I think it's true. I played football in school, and it was one of the only activities that I did that I can recall really making my father proud. He was a football coach to the core, and so it became an extension of pleasing my father. I'm not going to go into the Freudian theory that everything we do is to try to please our parents, but for me, it was to please my father. I didn't get a whole lot of attaboys from my dad. Wonderful man, but I didn't hear, that's my boy, a whole lot from him. But in football, I did. So after high school football, and I can remember my last game of the season, weeping, going outside the locker room and crying in the corner. I was so embarrassed. That's how much I loved football and how much it brought to me. The next year I discovered, and it was new, this competitive flag football. I discovered flag football. I don't want to spend too much time on this. So I played the first season, and then I was recruited by the state champs in flag football in all of Florida. And I said, yes, yes, they wanted me to play, and I was so excited. The whole reason is I was going to get a jacket that said state champs on it. And that was, I just knew I would never take that jacket, sleep in it, wear it everywhere. I wanted that jacket so desperately. So I played a season with them. And then I discovered that our tournaments, championship games were on Sundays. And I was not willing to compromise church for this, felt like my first love. I'm hoping church was, but for the first time, I felt this real conflict. So I still remember talking to Jimmy Wade. I don't know why I remember his name, but he was the defensive captain. I remember talking to him and telling him, I'll play all weekend, but I won't play Sundays. Well, short form this story, I could go on and on. Short form it caused that I was going to separate from this team. Because they didn't need me for the season games, they needed me for the playoff games. Seasons were to practice for the playoffs. And as it turned out, that caused me never to get my jacket. That caused me to have to leave the Resin Craft. I don't know why I'm spewing those names, but to leave Resin Craft as state champs. And they won the next 3 years. And I never got my jacket. And to a 20-year-old, I thought that was the greatest sacrifice I could make for the Lord. So I've given up things that are ingested into my body. I've given up a jacket and to play on state champs. And I thought I was something by doing this. When I was 40 and we had moved to Florida, I had an opportunity to take a job go back home to South Florida. Nick, forgive me for saying this. I think you're Ohio anyhow, so you probably won't be offended. But anyone who's in Kentucky, please don't be offended. But this wasn't home. This was just a stopover to get a couple years of management in and then go back to Florida, kind of LeBron James-esque. I was going to take my talents to South Florida. So I was going back home to South Florida. Not that it matters, but it did to me. The job was literally, they asked for how much money I made. They were literally doubling my pay to go back to South Florida. I had picked it up. They had me down in Fort Lauderdale. I said I didn't want, they had me in Houston. I said I didn't want to live in Houston. They put me in Fort Lauderdale. I said I don't want to live in Fort Lauderdale. I'm negotiating for something and they're giving me everything. I had my office in Lake Worth, Florida on 10th Avenue, had everything laid out. And then some of you have heard my testimony where the Lord said, you ask, but you ask amiss, basing all of your desires on your lusts, money, power, prestige. Go back home to my mom, take care of her after my dad had just passed away 6 months before that. Everything that I wanted this job for fulfilled all my natural needs. And so I went to the Lord one more time to pray, and he said no. And we stayed in Kentucky. I turned that down. To a 40-year-old who is probably upwardly mobile, trying to get something done, I felt I had sacrificed everything for this. And when I look back on it, all of this, the giving up the ingestion of outside influences, the giving up this jacket that I wanted to wear proudly everywhere I went, this job with such prestige and power and money, all of this is nothing in comparison to what he's given me. I'm telling you, I'm confessing to you that I thought I was something by making these sacrifices, and they're nothing in comparison to what the Lord has done for me. I want us to understand that. I don't want you to stop sacrificing. In fact, quite the contrary. But I want you to know he needs none of it. There's a verse that has always confused me. I confess my sins openly. Always confused me. Just had never really understood it. Or I understood it, but never really understood the depth of it. Remember what we said. Rightly dividing the word of truth. So we read verses and read other verses to tie them in to get a better understanding. This is in 1 Samuel 15. This is more scripture than I've read in a long time. But I hope it works for you. 1 Samuel 15, 22 and 23. Does the Lord in great delight delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices, in obeying the voice of the Lord. Does the Lord glory more in your sacrifice, burnt offerings, or does he glory in your obeying his word, is what that question means. So not to stumble. And the answer, behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, to listen better than the fat of rams, or whatever it might be, whatever your sacrifice is. To listen better than giving up your jacket, better than giving up that job. Just obey is what he's saying. So obedience is greater than sacrifice. I never got that. I still struggle with it, but I'm going to give you our theme and tell you what I think what it's saying in today's world, given a couple other verses. Goes on to say, because you have rejected the word of the Lord, because you have not obeyed, goes on to say, because you have rejected the word, he has also rejected you. The effects of your disobedience is he rejected you. If you're going to reject him, he's going to reject you. It's important to understand that. This is a precursor to the next verse. Jesus Christ says this, and I want you to understand this. This has nothing to do with the sermon today, but I want you to understand this. Other sheep I have, which are not of this fold, them I must also bring, and they shall hear my voice, they shall be one fold. I believe when the Savior died and resurrected that he visited all over the world. We have one account. The record of Joseph confirms that. So it's not my thoughts. I have my thoughts because it confirms that. But I believe he went to every nation, to every land, to every island, to all the outreaches. We had no online. We had no other way for him to get his message to the rest. Other sheep I have that aren't of this fold, Jerusalem, they'll also hear my voice. I believe they heard his voice. I believe he came to them like he went to the people of Peru, like he went to the people of Central America, like he went to the people of North America. I believe he did that all over the world in that time period. We know for 40 days he was in Jerusalem. Where else did he go? Is that the day that 40th day, is that the day that he clocked out forever? I don't believe it. And I don't believe 24 hours a day he was there for 40 days. I think he was going back and forth in that time period. Went into the upper room, resurrected, and then he left. Where did he go then? He didn't rest. He was a resurrected being. There was no reason to rest. Where did he go then? I believe he was letting everybody on this world, on this earth, know, I am the Christ. You have a chance for salvation. Here's what he said when he came to the Americas. We have this account, but I believe that when Naphtali and Reuben and Asher and the rest of the rest of the house of Israel bring their records forward, we're going to read something just like this in all those records. And again, I've said this a few times. If you go to the mysteries of other people, you'll find that a man visited during that resurrected time. Japan has records. Russia has records. India has records. All I did was Google resurrected Jesus Christ. Where did he visit? All these peoples have these records of a man coming to visit in that time. Confirming. I didn't come up with this idea, guys. I came up with this idea because of what I've read. So he went all these places. I believe he said this everywhere he went. You shall offer unto me no more shedding of blood. Yea, your sacrifices and burnt offerings shall be done away. You who have lived under the law of Moses, no more. For I will accept none of your sacrifices, none of your burnt offerings. You shall offer for a sacrifice unto me a broken heart and a contrite spirit, contrition, willingness, humility, that whatever I ask of you, you'll do. So our theme today is this: obedience is the sacrifice. By nature, we push against God's will. By nature, we push against his law. By nature, we push against him. How do I know? Because the word says the natural man, and I am a natural man just like you, the natural man is an enemy to God. Obedience is completely against our nature. The sacrifice is obedience. Now I understand, by the way, 1 Samuel. That's the new version of that. Now I get it. He'd rather us have obedience and sacrifice. Obedience itself is a sacrifice. It's against everything I am. All throughout it told me to live holy, to be blessed to the Lord. That's the sacrifice. If Candace says to me, or I say to her, can you do this or can you do that? There's a resistance almost immediately. So that's the universal sound of, I don't know if I'm going to hear that one. Because by nature, we push against. I believe it's why relationships don't last. I believe it's why there's such conflict in the world. I believe it's why, because we are giving in to the natural side of ourselves and not submitting to his spirit, to his will, because we're allowing our natural self to trump our spiritual self. We're allowing the old man to resurrect and drag down the new man. So what is the sacrifice? And you've heard it so many times, but I want you to rightly divide the word of truth. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, in Romans 12, by the mercies of God, I beseech you by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, result holy, acceptable unto God. Obedience is the sacrifice, which is your reasonable service. Why is that reasonable? Because it's not reasonable. Why is he calling it reasonable? Because Jesus the Christ sacrificed everything for you. Because God himself sacrificed everything for you. For God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son to come down to earth, live in humiliation and scorn and crucifixion. But long before that, for the 33 years before that, and especially the last 3 years, giving everything, sacrificing everything. I look on my screen and I see Courtney or Aubrey or Kylie. This is a father saying this. The joy I have seeing that. The Lord sacrificed his only begotten Son. I'm just a man, a foolish, silly man who takes pride in his children, and I will. Going forward, I'll still do that. I will. My God sacrificed his Son, his only Son, for me. How dare I? How dare I resist that? Be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And I read that only to read this, that you might prove, Candace, that your life might prove, Eric, that your life might prove, Nick, that your life might prove, Sister Donna, that your life might prove that which is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Let me read it again, that you might prove what is that good will of God, that you might prove what is that acceptable will of God, that you might prove what is that perfect will of God. And the only way to prove that is to go against your natures. Obedience is the sacrifice. Understand, when you give in to his will, it's all he asks of you. It's everything he asks of you. When you reach for your vices, when you speak language that's unacceptable, when you have thoughts about people because of their color or their creed or their culture, if you can stop before you fully realize whatever it is you're about to say or do, stop. Understand you're fulfilling something, that obedience is the sacrifice. God is love. It says if you don't love, you don't know God, because God is love. Love in spite of what the old man is telling you to do. Love because the new man says, we have a different way now. I stood on the waters and I said, I promise to do my best all the days of my life. I swore my allegiance to God and the sun on that riverfront, as did all of you. Do you promise to serve him, not serve self, serve him? And I said, yes. Did I know at 18 years old what I was giving into? I don't know. Probably not. Do I know much better at 63? I don't know. Probably not. But I'm learning. And everything I learn, I have responsibility for. And when I learn it, I now have to obey it. Why? Obedience is the sacrifice. One day, a woman said to my mom, and it just weighs on me all the time. My mom had a best friend, and she was very, very sick. My mom had been remiss at reaching out to her for a period of time. She was apologizing to the woman, saying, I'm so sorry I didn't. And the woman said something that was intended to free my mom up from the guilt that she was suffering from. And this woman said to my mom, oh, Letty, you're not that important. What she was saying is, don't take yourself down so much. In the whole scheme of things, you're not that important that because of your action, I've been crushed. I'm crushed because I'm so sick. I don't know how that conversation ended, but I'm hoping it ended. Just call me tomorrow. Just call me going forward. Don't regret yesterday. Whether she said that or not, I say that to you today. Don't wallow in your past. Don't wallow in the decisions you've made. Free yourself up. When you compare yourself to the goodness and greatness of God, understand your nothingness. Please don't be offended when I say this. We're not that important in the whole scheme of things. Don't take yourself down. You're not the worst of the worst. We all tie for last. All have come short of the glory of God. I'm part of all. I've come short, so I depend on the mercy and grace and forgiveness and love of God. How can I ever repay him? Do you love me? And his disciples said, yes, Lord. Or Peter at least said this. But Peter spoke for every one of you. Yes, I love you. Feed my sheep. Don't take that just as a call to the ministry. Nick Yepko, the Lord asks you, do you love me? And if you say, yes, I do, he's going to say to you, feed my sheep. How do you feed his sheep? You show them, you prove that good and acceptable will of God. You show them and prove the perfect will of God, especially those who knew you before. Imagine what they're going to say when they see the new Nick. Imagine what they're going to say when they see the new Leah Churchill. Imagine. Feed my sheep with your obedience. Feed the Lord with your obedience. Feed your spirit with the obedience. Obedience is the sacrifice. Watched some movie or some TV show this week. And it was a brother who was older and another brother who was younger who was mentally challenged. And the brother became the father to this younger brother. He cared for him, and he was the father figure. The father was absent and not a good father. And every night the older brother would tuck his younger brother in. 18 years old and 16. This is not a little brother 5 years old. It's a 16-year-old brother. He would tuck him in and talk to him before he went to sleep. And every night the younger brother asked the same thing. Much as Jesus Christ asked Peter, do you love me? The brother would stand at the door and he'd say, yes, I love you. And then he'd ask the second question, more than yourself? And the older brother would say, yes, I do. The Lord stands at your door right now and says to you, do you love me? And you'll say, yes. And rather than feed my sheep, he'll ask you, more than you love yourself? And if you can answer yes, then you understand this. Obedience is the sacrifice. May the Lord bless each one of you.